What happens when the very flag you fought for is the one your own neighborhood demands you take down? This is the story of Sergeant Joe Miller, a U.S. Army veteran who never imagined his greatest battle for freedom would take place not on foreign soil, but in his own front yard. His story is not only about one man's defiance, it is about what happens when power is unchecked, when rules lose sight of reason, and when ordinary neighbors must decide whether silence is easier than standing up for what is right. Joe Miller was, by most measures, an ordinary man living an ordinary life. But behind that quiet routine was a soldier's past. 2 decades in uniform, 2 tours overseas, years of training, discipline, and sacrifice, and the kind of memories that never leave you. The faces of brothers in arms, the names etched into memorials, the sound of the flag being folded over a coffin and handed to a grieving mother. Joe came home with scars, some visible, many not. Like so many veterans, he longed for peace, for normalcy, for the rhythm of suburban life. His wife had found them a modest house in a gated community, complete with sidewalks where their kids could ride bikes, a backyard for barbecues, and a front porch that looked out over the cul-de-sac. To Joe, it felt safe. It felt steady. It felt like the reward at the end of long years of uncertainty. Every morning, Joe's day began the same way. Before breakfast, before coffee, before the world could rush in, he would step outside with a small ritual. He walked to the flagpole planted firmly in his yard, grasped the rope, and slowly raised the stars and stripes into the morning sky. He tugged until the fabric caught the wind, and for a moment he simply stood there, hand over his heart, remembering why it mattered. And every evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, he lowered it with the same care, folding it properly before carrying it inside. To the neighbors, it might have seemed like habit, but for Joe, it was reverence, it was duty, it was remembrance. The flag was more than cloth, it was memory, woven with the lives of men who never returned. Joe once told a friend, "Every time I raise it, I see their faces. I hear their voices. I can't let a day pass without honoring them." To him, the porch flag was not decoration. It was a promise that the sacrifices made overseas would not be forgotten in the comfort of home. But beyond Joe's porch, another kind of authority held sway. The Homeowners Association, 3 simple letters that carried enormous weight. The HOA was not elected by the nation. It did not defend freedom. It did not carry the burden of sacrifice. But within the walls of its neighborhood, it ruled with near absolute authority. And in Joe's community, the HOA was not a suggestion, it was law. The board was made up of neighbors, yes, but once seated, they became something else. They decided what color your shutters could be. They approved or denied the swing sets in your backyard. They measured the length of your grass, and they ticketed your car if it stayed too long in the driveway. They issued citations, fines, even liens. They told themselves they were protecting property values, but the homeowners often whispered another word: control. In Joe's neighborhood, the HOA's power was infamous. Residents learned quickly what happened when you crossed them. A family once received 3 separate notices in a single week. One for leaving a garbage bin visible, one for having a basketball hoop too close to the street, and one for painting their mailbox the wrong shade of black. The fines weren't large at first, but they piled up fast. Some paid immediately, fearful of confrontation. Others contested, only to find themselves buried in paperwork and legal threats. In the end, most surrendered, not because they believed in the rules, but because fighting cost too much. This was the landscape Joe walked into. He had no quarrel with order. He believed in discipline, in responsibility, in carrying your weight for the good of the community. For a while, he went along. He paid his dues on time. He kept his truck polished, his lawn trimmed, his hedges squared off. He nodded politely to the board members when he saw them at meetings, though he could never quite shake the sense that their smiles hit a gavel. He lived quietly, raising his children, tending to his family, lowering his flag each evening with solemn care. For years, there was no issue. Until the summer it happened. The smallest detail can ignite the largest fire. And in Joe's case, that detail was the flagpole planted near his porch. The pole had stood there for months without objection. The flag had waved through holidays, through Memorial Day barbecues, through 4th of July fireworks. Neighbors even complimented it. But one day someone complained. A board member noticed. A rule was cited. And suddenly Joe Miller's flag was not a symbol of freedom. It was an infraction. That is how it begins. Not with sirens, not with confrontation, but with paper. A notice slipped into a mailbox. Black ink on white paper carrying the weight of authority. Words that sound clinical, detached, even reasonable, but words that cut to the bone. Violation, remove the flag or face fines. That letter would change everything. It would turn Joe Miller's quiet life into a public storm. It would test the strength of a neighborhood, the courage of a veteran, and the patience of a nation. The HOA thought it was enforcing a rule, but what it really enforced was a question every American watching would soon ask themselves. If a soldier can't fly his flag at home, what exactly are we protecting? It began quietly, as so many battles do, with a single envelope. One hot afternoon in late July, Joe Miller came home from the hardware store with a box of nails and a jug of gasoline for his lawnmower. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw the familiar white envelope tucked neatly into his mailbox, the HOA's logo stamped in the corner. He thought little of it, perhaps a reminder about dues, or another cheerful newsletter announcing the date of the next community yard sale. But when he tore it open, the words inside stopped him cold. Violation notice. That was the heading in bold capital letters. Beneath it, in sterile legal phrasing, the board informed Joe that the American flag flying from his front yard flagpole was in violation of community architectural standards. The letter went on to say that the display disrupted the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood and that it must be removed within 10 days. Failure to comply would result in fines beginning at $50 a day, escalating for each day of noncompliance. Joe read it twice, then a third time. His wife, seeing the look on his face, asked softly, "What is it?" Without a word, he handed her the paper. She scanned it, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to anger. "They can't be serious," she muttered. But they were. The HOA was dead serious. That night, Joe sat at the kitchen table, the letter spread before him. He had faced enemies with rifles. He had endured nights without sleep under hostile skies. But never had he imagined he would be ordered to remove the one symbol that gave those battles meaning. The irony was bitter. He whispered to himself, "I didn't serve my country to be told I can't fly my flag at home." Instead of complying, Joe took a magnet and pinned the letter to the refrigerator, where it stayed, a daily reminder of the fight he now faced. To him, it wasn't just paper. It was a challenge, and he was not a man to back down. 10 days passed. The flag stayed up. Joe went about his routine, raising it every morning, lowering it every evening. On the 11th day, another letter arrived. This one sterner, colder. The polite phrasing was gone, replaced with sharp edges. Final warning. It ordered immediate compliance and gave him 5 days to remove the flag or face legal action. Attached was a copy of the fines schedule, numbers neatly stacked like ammunition, ready to be fired. Angry folly. But Joe's answer was the same: silence, defiance. The flag remained. Each flutter in the breeze became its own reply, each snap of fabric a statement louder than words. No. The HOA increased its pressure. Letters came weekly, sometimes twice a week. They arrived in the same plain envelopes, the same impersonal font, but the tone darkened. They spoke of liens against the property, of legal fees added to fines, of court orders and forced compliance. To most homeowners, such threats were enough. Many, before Joe, had folded at the first mention of legal proceedings. But Joe was not most homeowners. Every morning, neighbors saw him walk to the flagpole, lift the rope, and raise the stars and stripes into the air. Children biking to school would glance up at the porch and whisper to each other about Mr. Miller's flag. Parents, walking dogs or jogging past, would nod quietly, though some looked nervously around before doing so, as if the board could see their approval. Small acts of support began to spread, one neighbor placing a miniature flag in a flower pot, another taping a red, white, and blue ribbon to their mailbox. Silent gestures, but gestures that mattered. In hushed tones, conversations began. "Have you heard what they're doing to Joe? He's still refusing? Good for him. Someone needs to stand up to them." But not all the whispers were supportive. Some neighbors worried aloud about what would happen if Joe lost. "They could go after us next," one said. "The board's not going to let him win. They never do." Fear spread like a shadow across the cul-de-sac. For some, Joe's defiance was inspiring. For others, it was dangerous. Inside the HOA's meeting room, a sterile space with fluorescent lighting, a folding table, and binders stacked like law books, the board debated Joe's case. Minutes were recorded, motions were made. Some argued that exceptions couldn't be allowed. Others expressed unease, worried about the optics of fining a veteran for flying the American flag. But the hardliners won. The official decision was unanimous: enforce the rules. No exceptions. They believed that to yield here would mean chaos everywhere. If Joe could keep his flag, what would stop another resident from painting their shutters neon green or erecting a 20-foot statue in their yard? To the board, this was about precedent. To Joe, it was about principle. The fines began to accumulate on paper, $50 a day, then $100. The running total climbed past $1,000, then $2. Threats of liens grew sharper. Legal language filled the letters like bullets in a chamber. Still, Joe raised his flag. Still, he refused. Serious. At night, Joe sometimes lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He wondered how far they would go. Would they drag him into court? Could they force him to sell his house? He had fought for freedom overseas, but here, in the comfort of suburbia, he faced a different kind of war. A war of paper, fines, and signatures. And yet, every time doubt crept in, he pictured the faces of his brothers in arms, the men who never came back. And he told himself, if I back down here, what does their sacrifice mean? That thought gave him strength. By now, the conflict was no longer hidden. The neighborhood buzzed with tension. The HOA doubled down, believing they could bury Joe in bureaucracy. But what they failed to realize was that in trying to silence one man, they had sparked something far larger. The whispers grew louder. A neighbor mentioned the story to a friend at the local paper. A short article appeared, "Veteran fined for flying American flag." It was small, buried deep in the community section, but the spark was lit. Soon, reporters would be knocking on Joe's door. Soon, cameras would be parked outside the cul-de-sac. And soon, the fight would move from paper to public view. The HOA believed they could force Joe Miller into submission with threats and fines. But what they had done, in truth, was awaken a storm. A storm that would not be contained by envelopes and bylaws. Joe Miller's battle was no longer his alone. It was about to become America's. By the end of that week, the story had outgrown the cul-de-sac. It began with a whisper, a neighbor quietly mentioning Joe's situation to a friend at the local paper. A reporter, curious, drove out to see for herself. She expected a small dispute, another community interest piece buried in the back pages. What she found instead was a flag flying high from the porch of a decorated veteran and a folder of violation notices stacked an inch thick. She snapped a photo, asked a few questions, and by the next morning the headline read, "HOA orders veteran to remove American flag." The headline was enough. Readers shared it. Radio hosts repeated it. A short television segment aired on the evening news, showing Joe standing on his porch, the flag waving proudly behind him. The reporter's closing line was simple, but devastating. He fought for that flag overseas. Now he fights for it at home. Did you hear about the veteran with the flag? They fined him just for flying it. That's not America. That's madness. What had begun as an HOA letter had become a public controversy. Neighbors who once looked away now stopped to shake Joe's hand. Cars driving past slowed down, passengers leaning out to shout words of encouragement. "Stand strong, we've got your back." One man rolled down his window and said, "I'll pay your fines if I have to." Joe, humble and soft-spoken, only nodded in thanks. He had never asked for allies, but they were arriving all the same. The reporters returned with bigger cameras, brighter lights, tougher questions. They wanted to know what Joe thought of the HOA, whether he feared losing his house, whether he would consider compromise. Joe stood firm. He didn't rant, he didn't curse. He simply said, "I respect rules. I respect order, but this isn't about rules. This is about respect for the flag, for the people who gave everything for it. That's not negotiable." The HOA board, faced with growing attention, tried to defend its actions. They issued a statement filled with clinical language. The association enforces community standards fairly and consistently. Unauthorized displays create disorder and conflict with established aesthetic guidelines. But instead of quieting the storm, their words made it worse. People read aesthetic guidelines and shook their heads. Since when was the American flag an aesthetic problem? Talk shows seized the story. Hosts thundered into microphones. Imagine this: a veteran told by his own HOA that his flag is ugly, disruptive, unwelcome. What's next? Banning Christmas lights? Outlawing barbecues? Call-in lines lit up. "This is un-American," one caller shouted. Another vowed, "If they try that in my town, they'll have to come through me first." The outrage spread faster than the board could issue statements. What they had thought was a small, private matter had become a national spectacle. Legal experts were brought in to analyze the dispute. A constitutional scholar explained on live TV that while HOAs are private entities, many states have passed laws specifically protecting the right to display the U.S. flag. These laws exist for exactly this reason, she said, to prevent overreach, to prevent homeowners from being told their patriotism is a violation. A retired judge added, "If this HOA pushes the matter into court, I would expect a very swift decision against them." But the HOA board did not retreat. Instead, they doubled down. In a second statement, they insisted, "This is not a question of patriotism. It is a question of procedure. All homeowners agreed to abide by the same rules when they moved in. Consistency is essential to community harmony." The words rang hollow. To the public, it sounded like bureaucracy strangling common sense. One commentator quipped, "Harmony? You've got neighbors flying flags in solidarity, news crews camped on the street, and the entire internet calling you tyrants. If that's harmony, I'd hate to hear what chaos looks like." Meanwhile, Joe's neighborhood transformed. Flags sprouted like wildflowers. Porches, mailboxes, gardens, all carried some version of red, white, and blue. Children painted stars in chalk across driveways. Families tied ribbons around trees. The street itself became a declaration. This wasn't just Joe's fight anymore. It was theirs too. One neighbor taped a handwritten sign to their window, "We stand with Joe." Another left a note on his doorstep, "Thank you for reminding us what courage looks like." Joe, humbled by the support, kept his routine. Each morning he walked to the flagpole, raised the flag, and saluted. Reporters sometimes asked if he would change anything about his approach. He always answered the same, "I'm not here to fight my neighbors. I'm here to honor my country. That's all." His steady demeanor, calm, dignified, unyielding, won him more respect than anger ever could. Coverage spread further. National outlets picked up the story. Veterans organizations issued statements of solidarity. Lawmakers began asking questions. One congressman from a nearby district wrote, "No veteran should face punishment for flying the American flag on his own property, period." Petitions gained thousands of signatures overnight. One online campaign raised money to help cover Joe's fines, though he hadn't asked for it. The fight had become symbolic, and symbols carry power. The HOA's internal meetings grew frantic. Minutes from one session later leaked revealed deep divisions. One board member argued, "This is a disaster, we need to stop now." Another insisted, "If we give in, we'll lose all authority. No one will respect the bylaws again." The vote to continue enforcement was narrow, but it was enough. The board clung to procedure, blind to the storm surrounding them. They sent Joe yet another letter, this one threatening liens and the possibility of foreclosure if fines went unpaid. It was a weapon of last resort, the HOA's nuclear option, but it backfired. When word spread that a decorated veteran could lose his home for flying the flag, outrage boiled over. "Disgraceful," shouted callers on radio shows. "This is tyranny in a neighborhood," said one news anchor. Online, the hashtag #StandWithJoe began trending. Support poured in. Letters arrived at Joe's doorstep from strangers in other states, some handwritten, some typed. "We're praying for you. Don't give up. My father was a veteran. I wish he could see what you're doing." A retired Marine sent Joe his own unit patch with a note. "You're still fighting for all of us." Joe, usually a man of few words, admitted quietly, "I never thought so many people cared. I thought it was just me." Legal analysts sharpened their focus. They cited state statutes word by word. They explained that federal law explicitly protects the right to fly the U.S. flag, limiting what HOAs can regulate. They noted that courts had repeatedly sided with homeowners in similar cases. The conclusion was consistent. The HOA was not just wrong morally, but legally. One commentator summed it up. "This board isn't defending harmony. It's daring a judge to humiliate them in court." But the board pressed forward. Pride, perhaps, or stubbornness, or fear of losing face. They believed they were preserving consistency. In truth, they were digging their own grave. Every letter they sent, every threat they issued, every public statement they made pushed the public further away. By the end of the second week of media coverage, the question was no longer whether Joe would lose his flag. The question was whether the HOA itself could survive the backlash. The storm was at its peak. Joe's porch had become America's porch. The flag waving above it had become a rallying cry. The board was outnumbered, out-argued, and out of touch. And yet, they clung to their paperwork as though ink could stop a wave. The next move would decide everything. Would they drag Joe into court, risking public humiliation and likely defeat? Or would they retreat, swallowing their pride in silence? The answer was coming, and the nation was watching. The HOA thought it could outlast him. They believed fines, liens, and legal threats would crush Sergeant Joe Miller into compliance. But by the third week of public outrage, something shifted. Their inbox was flooded, not with compliance, but with condemnation. Their voicemail filled with messages from angry strangers demanding justice. And every news segment, every social media post, every interview pushed the board deeper into a corner. They had become the villains of their own neighborhood, and the nation had chosen a side. It was not theirs. Then, one quiet morning, Joe walked to his mailbox and found another letter. Same white envelope, same HOA logo in the corner, but inside, the words were different. "Upon further review," the letter said, "the violation notices regarding your flag have been withdrawn. No further fines will be imposed. This matter is considered closed." There was no apology. There was no admission of wrongdoing. Just silence dressed as resolution. But to Joe, that silence spoke louder than any fine, any threat, any meeting gavel. The board had retreated, the flag had won. Joe showed the letter to his wife. She read it once, then set it down with tears in her eyes. "So that's it?" she asked. Joe nodded. "That's it. The flag stays." Together they stepped onto the porch and looked up. The stars and stripes rippled in the morning breeze, unbothered, undefeated. For the first time in weeks, Joe allowed himself a small smile. Not triumph, not arrogance, just quiet relief. The fight was over. Word spread quickly. Reporters returned for one last interview. The anchor who had first covered the story closed her segment with a simple line: "The flag stays." Across the country, that sentence echoed in headlines and broadcasts. The flag stays. It was the ending people wanted, the ending they felt was right. Neighbors marked the victory in their own ways. Some raised new flags, brighter, larger than before. Children drew chalk murals of stars and stripes on sidewalks. One family baked a cake decorated in red, white, and blue icing and delivered slices door to door with the words, "For Joe." Another hung a banner between two oak trees, "Home of the free because of the brave." The cul-de-sac, once quiet, became a symbol of something greater, a reminder that communities are not built by rules alone, but by courage and solidarity. Joe did not gloat, he did not shout. He remained himself, steady, respectful, calm. When asked what he had learned, he told a reporter, "You don't have to raise your voice to stand your ground. Sometimes you just have to show up every day and refuse to move." He gestured toward his porch. "That flag is not about me. It's about the people I served with. I owed them this stand." The HOA chastened, tried to spin the retreat as an administrative correction. They spoke of miscommunication and clarifying policies, but their reputation was scarred. Homeowners who once followed quietly now questioned openly. If they were wrong about this, one neighbor asked, what else have they been wrong about? Meetings grew tenser, elections grew sharper, and slowly the board realized they had taught their community a dangerous lesson, that power can be resisted and sometimes resistance wins. Beyond the cul-de-sac, the story had ripple effects. Homeowners in other states dusted off their HOA rule books, scanning for clauses that might overstep. Veterans groups shared guides on legal protections for flag displays. Legislators proposed tightening state laws to make sure no board could ever again order a veteran to take down the stars and stripes. One senator gave a speech on the floor, citing Joe's story directly. Freedom is not defended overseas, only to be denied at home. We owe our veterans better than that. The lesson was simple but profound. Communities need rules, yes, but rules must serve people, not crush them. A rule that bans the flag is not protecting harmony. It is erasing the very values the community claims to uphold. If the law exists to defend freedom, then no bylaw should be used to erase it. And so the flag remains, on Joe's porch, on his neighbors' porches, across the country and yards inspired by his stand. It waves in the morning breeze and settles in the evening calm. It carries different meanings for different people, but for Joe, it will always mean the same thing: the faces of brothers who never came home, the promise of a nation that despite its flaws is still worth fighting for. Some nights, Joe still lies awake, thinking of the men he lost, the weight he carries, the battles fought in silence. But when he steps outside at dawn, rope in hand, and raises that flag again, he feels their presence, he feels their memory, and he feels in his own quiet way that he has honored them. For the neighborhood, Joe's victory was a reminder. For the nation, it was a symbol. For other veterans, it was validation. And for HOAs across America, it was a warning. Power without reason invites resistance. The people you govern are not subjects, they are neighbors. They are citizens. And sometimes, they are soldiers who have already faced down far greater threats than a boardroom with paperwork. If there is one lesson to take from Joe Miller's fight, it is this: freedom does not vanish quietly. It does not bow to envelopes or signatures. It lives wherever someone is willing to stand firm, even in the smallest of places. Sometimes freedom looks like a battlefield, sometimes it looks like a porch, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to lower the flag. The HOA did not lower Joe's flag. They simply stopped trying to. And in that silence, in that retreat, was the sound of victory. A victory that belonged not to paperwork, not to procedure, but to principle. The porch is quiet again. The neighborhood is calm again. But the flag still waves, unbothered, undefeated, and unbroken. As steady as the man who raised it, as eternal as the promise it represents. This was not just Joe's fight. This was America's reminder. Freedom must be protected not only in foreign lands, but in our own neighborhoods, our own streets, our own homes. And as long as there are men and women willing to stand, calmly, steadily, with dignity, freedom will never fall. One battle ended here, but many more remain. What's your HOA nightmare? Share it below and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.